Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from Biosphere, Angel's Flight. Biosphere, Gear Jansen. It's been a while since I've talked about this guy. Obviously, back in 2019, I did a full discography review for him. I've covered his previous output in great detail. So now that he has a new main release, I kinda had to talk about it. For those of you who weren't around for that series, Guy's a masterful ambient composer. He's obviously got one album from 1997 called Substrata that towers above everything else he's done, but also a pretty consistent back catalog around it that covers lots of different bases, from some pioneering ambient techno releases in the mid-early 90s, to stuff that chops up and melts together old recordings of classical music, to mixes of Boards of Canada-esque synth doodles and oddly relaxing jazzy break beats, to some of the most minimalistic stuff you've ever heard in your life. If you want more detailed thoughts on his older stuff, you can watch any of my reviews, or if you don't want to spend time on those, I have a worst to best ranking video that summarizes everything in a more concise manner. I will say, though, one thing that does have to be reiterated, that as consistent as he might have been through the 90s and 2000s, his stuff in the 2010s could be a little more hit and miss. There have been two legit gems he put out in the last decade, with End Plants in 2011 and the Senja recordings in 2019, and his projects would always at least have like an interesting idea behind them, even at their very worst. See the spooky and conceptually interesting but airy and forgettable Departed Glories, the underdeveloped but still mildly engaging field recording driven outings of the Hilverenbeek recordings, or the oddly misconceived glitch opera of L'Incarnazione d'Epopeia, which was mostly just repetitive samples with a really overbearing tremolo filter applied to everything that got really grating. As for this newest project, Angel's Flight, originally composed as a companion to a Norwegian dance production in 2019 called Uncoordinated Dog, it does perhaps unfortunately have that same feel of like a one-off side note to his overall career than it does something particularly important or memorable or special in its own right. But I think I can say I enjoy it a bit more than all those other lower points I just mentioned. The idea behind this one is similar to quite a few others he's done before. He's once again taking like old classical recordings, this time from an old Beethoven composition, and melting them into minimalistic ambient pieces. On paper, that sounds like what he did on, say, his 2002 album Shenzhou, one of my biggest personal favorites of his. And while it does have some elements in common with that one, in execution it comes a little closer to his 2016 album Departed Glories. It's all a bit on the airy side, and these tracks are not as well defined as they could be, though they are better defined than the ones on Departed Glories. The idea is also kind of like a lower key and more easily replayable but less emotionally impactful take on the kinds of ideas that William Basinski explored on his recent Lamentations album from last year. I do feel like I'm more likely to want to come back to this album than that one, but that's mainly because that one had some really emotionally devastating stuff in it that hit a lot of anxiety buttons. Angel's Flight, it's not a project that I can say I have particularly strong feelings on, but I did generally enjoy it. In terms of individual tracks, I will say the first 4 tracks of this thing all kind of blend together into like a singular shifting blur of airy violins filtered to sound like synth pads. It's quiet and minimalistic and does convey a palpable mood as you'd want out of any project from this guy. It can feel rather windy and empty, and there's not the slightest hint of bass anywhere to be found, but it does make use of that emptiness to build its mood, as has been one of Biosphere's biggest strengths in the past 20-odd years. Stripped back minimalism is what he does. Of the pieces in this opening stretch, I'll say Sudden Rush and In the Ballroom were probably the most emotionally affecting for me, the former solid opener and tone setter, and the latter of those giving the violins a bit more textural definition despite mostly still feeling like drone pieces. And As Bright as the Night might be my least favorite of these as it got a bit repetitive, but is still all very nice. As you get further into the album, the tracks do have a bit more identity apart from each other. The drones on As Weird as the Elfin Lights get notably more lo-fi with some light distortion, and the title track has actual punctuated synth rhythms that sound like they could have been pulled out of one of his older projects like Cirque. Or perhaps they're not synths and just lo-fi string samples with a heavy tremolo filter being made to sound like synth sequences. But if so, the execution is way better than similar pieces on the Popea album, the airy flute lines layered on top giving the piece more grounding and less like it has a single overbearing filter on top. Also benefiting from being the only track on this project that sounds like that. I mean, I think if I had to pick a single favorite track from here, it'd probably be this one, the title track. Anyway, As Pale as a Pearl is another airy violin piece in line with the first four. Might be a little more impactful than any one of them individually. Also, that one has like this odd outro with all these repetitive glitchy fade-ins that's kind of neat. Then as we move further into the back half of this project, the source material that Biosphere is pulling from becomes a lot more obvious, with cuts like Faith and Reverence, Unclouded Splendor, and Scan of Waves, that have their string performances much more dynamic and obviously coming from classical music rather than feeling more drone-like, in line with most of Biosphere's other later period work. The former of those three is probably my favorite, as it's the most openly dynamic piece on the album, with its string patterns quickly trading off between slow and drone-like and these oddly more energetic and fast-paced riffs that feel like they're tumbling over each other. Scan of Waves is probably my least favorite of those three, as it felt a bit monolithic and drab and repetitive, mostly just the same chords playing over and over. But that isn't the least interesting moment on here. In between some of those is a darker interlude called Remote and Distant, which still stood out as a favorite, given how it is probably the bassiest piece here. It may not break 2 minutes, but it still leaves an impact and feels satisfying. Less satisfying is the closer, The Clock in the Dial, which really goes all in on William Basinski-style audio disintegration. The samples start out fairly untouched, but get glitchier and more lo-fi and more distorted as you go on, and the effect starts to sound really grating by the end. Wasn't huge on that one, even if it does make sense as an ending. But yeah, that's everything on Angel's Flight. It's a perfectly agreeable ambient classical crossover that did have enough emotional power to work for me, and no outright bad moments. But is it anything altogether special in the grander scheme of Biosphere's back catalog? No, not really. If I were to place it in the worst to best ranking video I did, I think I would put it like in between the Hilvarenbeek recordings and Potashnik. This project feels better developed and fleshed out, and just all around more consistent than the former of those two, despite a less unique idea. But it's not as fun or dynamic a listen as the latter either. It's an album that's mostly just kind of there. I kind of doubt I'll be keeping it long term. But hey, if this all sounds interesting to you, or you've just been a long time fan of Biosphere, it's still worth giving a shot. It's a fine project, it's nice to listen to. I guess I'm overall feeling like a 6.7 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.